Here's two questions. Contemporary philosophers, the last 30, 40 years have been asked to go find these sentences in various people's writings. One big question, made particularly famous, at least in this form, Elation, by Hilary Putnam, is the question, how does language hook onto the world? Hook is a kind of metaphor, but a less graphic metaphor might be something like, how does language connect with, or how can language be in touch with, how can language really make firm, stable contact? How do the words get a hold of the things such they don't lose them again? You say stuck to them if you want an even more graphic picture. That's a bunch of words. There's actually, when different people go on to ask this question, they might ask it slightly differently. One of the things they'll be worried about is whether those differences make a difference. So one kind of question would be, how do we know whether we mean this or that? Or how do we tell if we're talking about this or that? How do we tell if our words are hooking onto that thing or this thing? Or this kind of stuff or that kind of stuff? That's an epistemic question. How do we tell? How do we know whether it's a case of the word picking out this rather than that? I'm going to try to show you, before we're done today, that that's a Cartesian construal of this question, in the sense of Cartesian. We spent some time trying to elucidate in the previous lectures. Another way to understand the question would be something like, how is it that language could so much as have a bearing in the world? How could words so much as have meaning? How could there be something which is my taking myself to mean water when I say water? Regardless of whether I've got it right or not. But I take myself to be saying something such that there's rightness or wrongness involved. How could that word have a meaning such that the meaning I take it to have might, involve correct or incorrect use? That's a Kantian question. Here's another question, which we'll focus on today. How a do-are, let's just put it this way without a how. We could turn this into a how question. Let's just put it this way because it's how it comes up in our reading for today. Do our cognitive processes reach the objects themselves? Or if you want to be a little more vivid with your metaphor, reach all the way to the objects themselves. If you take the cognitive power in question to be something like perception, you're concerned with perceptual knowledge. That can be a question you can ask within a Cartesian picture. How can my perceptual experience that I'm standing in front of a classroom of students reach all the way to the fact that there's a classroom full of students? Isn't it just a perceptual experience? I could be dreaming and be exactly the same. So the fact itself transcends my cognitive powers of perception. It's always something more. It always falls short. It's always on this side of the veil of perception, or the Cartesian gap, in this case, a perceptual gap. That's one way to understand it. It's not the only way to understand the question. Maybe you can see what the other way is. If not, we'll get there. So here are two questions. These two questions themselves. This question itself, since cognitive powers can involve our cognitive powers for talking and thinking, as well as perceiving and knowing, this question can also taken to be a species of this question on either of its understandings. So what we're going to talk about is these questions and how unclarity about what we're asking here can get us into trouble. We're going to do this today by looking at the American philosopher Hilary Putnam. This is a slightly awkward exercise for me because Hilary Putnam was my PhD director. I have incredible respect for him. I do really think, without hopefully being biased, that he is one of the great and important philosophers of the second half of the 20th century. But one of his virtues, one thing I like about him a lot, which is somewhat unusual in Anglo-American philosophy, at least when I was growing up, it's less unusual now, is that he's, in the following respect, is more like a continental philosopher, if you will. He works on a lot of different areas of philosophy, and he cares about having what the Germans call an Überblick. in philosophy. So he wants to know different areas are connected. He has a sense that problems that are coming up in philosophy of quantum mechanics are not all that different in form from questions that are coming up in very different areas of philosophy, and brings his wisdom from one area to another, back and forth. I think that's all to the good. It's been a great exemplar for me there. But that also means when you do that, there's all sorts of possibilities of confusion. When you pick up roots and point down another local debate, it sounds a little bit like that one. Are they the same debate or not? So that's one issue about Putnam as he tries to connect things in the reading for today. Senses, sense, nonsense, and the senses. Is that what it's called? Sense, nonsense, and the senses. His Dewey lectures. Is he connecting the dots between these different issues that are coming up correctly? Also, it's perhaps worth saying something about Putnam autobiographically for a moment. Putnam has worked in a lot of different areas of philosophy. He's also famous for changing his mind a lot. So he's not a philosopher who's stayed stuck. There's a joke in a book called The Philosopher's Lexicon, which I think you can get online if any of you are interested. It's edited by Daniel Dennett, which consists of entries that are words that have meanings, but they're formed out of the last names of philosophers, mostly analytic philosophers. And one word is Hilary. A Hilary is a unit of time during which a famous philosopher holds a view. 6 weeks long. As in, I held that view 2 or 3 Hilarys ago. And according to Dennett's lexicon, that's the origin of the expression Hilary term at Oxford. Oxford has 3 terms, Trinity, Michaelmas, and Hilary. They're about 6 weeks long. The joke is they're named after Hilary Putnam, because that's how long he holds a view. That's an exaggeration. It also makes it sound like he changes his mind more than he does. What I'm more interested in is not exactly what view he holds, but what kinds of topics he's working on. That's the start I wanted to say something about for a moment. And there, too, there's been some shift. A paper he wrote in the mid-'70s was very famous. It's called The Meaning of Meaning. That paper had to do with, it's one of the places this question came up, how and whether language hooks onto the world. Putnam put forward a view that later became called semantic externalism. I don't think we need to worry about all the details here right now. But one thing I'll point out is that even there's a kind of instability about what the question is. The initial thought experiment in that paper, which Putnam made very famous, and it's a kind of thought experiment people run for lots of things now. It's the so-called twin Earth thought experiment. He ran it about, you can run this about lots of things. People now run them in personal identity and for self-knowledge and for all kinds of issues. It's a kind of thought experiment. Once you see you can run it in philosophy, you can start running them. In other areas, Putnam's thought experiment went like this. Imagine we're on our planet, we're in a certain situation. We have something that looks just like water, and we drink it. And we talk about it, and we say, that's water. Now imagine people on another planet. That planet has slightly different physical and chemical properties from our planet. So on that planet, the thing that's running free, that's falling from the earth, that's coming out of springs, that you can drink, that's good for you, is not chemically identical to water. If you run to write down its chemical equation, it would not be H2O. It doesn't really matter what its chemical equation is. It could be H2O plus something, it could be a little different, it could be lighter. Actually, it doesn't matter at this point. All that matters is it's not water in the sense in which water is H2O. Putnam just says, without specifying any further, it's XYZ. We don't need to know what its chemical formula is. We don't even know how much it's like water. It's not identical. And then the point is, I'm going to put this in a way that will make a certain connection explicit, but it's there already. From within, these two scenarios are not distinguishable. If I'm on Earth, or if I'm on twin Earth, and I say water, I can't tell if I'm in a situation in which I'm talking about H2O or XYZ. That is, I hope you see, I could spell this out further, but for those of you who know the article, I hope you see that this is a Cartesian format in the sense in which I've tried to bring out how those things work. We have here something which is a paradigm case, or best case, for a word whose meaning we know. You don't have to be an expert. At least initially looks like you don't need to be an expert. That's in Putnam's initial attempt to solve this. Looks like maybe you do need experts, even to say what the meaning of water is. That's one premise that can be challenged, hence the thesis of the linguistic distribution of labor. But in the initial setup, it looks like we have a pretty good case of a word we know how to use. And then we construct a scenario. We don't do it this time through dreaming, but we do it through a different kind of scenario, in which we can't tell whether we're in the usual situation or in that situation. We have no way from within in which we can tell. And then we can raise a doubt about, are we in such situations really referring to water or not? You can make a less humdrum case than twin Earth. I could pour you a glass of something that's chemically not, strictly speaking, water. It's got a little bit of something else into it. In fact, in America, the water in certain parts of the country has fluoride in it, which is very good for you. Don't worry. There are some people that worry that if we have fluoride in our water stream, the commies, since the Cold War's ended, they're not quite as worried about this. Now with Al-Qaeda, they're starting to get worried about putting anything in the water again. But the point is, they're not drinking pure H2O. They can't tell. You could have run the thought experiment without twin Earth. All twin Earth does is make very visible, as it were, the Cartesian structure of the thought experiment. The reason it's called semantic externalism, Putnam's conclusion in this famous paper is, meanings ain't in the head, as he put it in his inimitable American. Is he starting to, there it looks like he's starting to challenge a certain Cartesian assumption about the structure of the gap. That is, the natural Cartesian assumption is, as in the case of perception, what it is to perceive a certain state of affairs. That's here. How things are. That's over there. Similar assumption with respect to meaning, whether I mean water or not, what my words mean, that's something like a function of something that's in my mind. And then how things are in the world, that swings free of what's in my mind. And what Putnam tried to bring out with that experiment is, if that were true, we'd never actually know. Putting it in Cartesian terms for the moment. The paper's actually hovering, but I'll put it in Cartesian terms for the moment. We never actually know if our words mean what they do. Putnam's way of trying to crash that assumption is to actually break. I'm not saying he puts it this way. I'm saying you can see what he's doing. It's fitting in other cases. Break with a fundamental Cartesian assumption about the gap and say that it's not true, that the realm of meaning is a self-standing realm. How it is completely constituted from the near side of the gap. And what things mean, whether they mean that or not successfully, that's on the far side of the gap, and we can't get there unless we have access to some divine sideways on point of view. Rather, he wants to suggest, no, what the words mean is itself a fact of the environment. That's his way of starting to try to break the Cartesian mold. So initially, in early Putnam, you have a question that clearly follows a Cartesian format in the way it gets you puzzled. And the initial question is, can you tell or not? But what happens, and it's starting to happen already in that article, and what clearly happens in later Putnam's work, I'm just going to say this quickly, we'll have more occasion to talk about this next class. I'm just going to say this now, is it starts to turn into a Kantian question. So by the time you look at a book like Reason, Truth, and History, you read the opening chapters of Reason, Truth, and History, the question is Putnam's struggling with there is, how can our words refer? What's the difference between, he changes the example, but let's not. We had a word that was water, and we had a word that was water star. Example there is cat star, but let's not worry about that. That is, another word, whose extension was very similar but not identical to this. What would it mean for me to mean one thing rather than another? What would it be for there to be determinate content to my referring one way rather than another? Now it's not, we know the difference between these two things, how can we tell? The question is turning to a question about what is reference such that there is something which is referring with other words. So as Putnam, and this becomes even more explicit if you look at later Putnam in the 80s and early 90s, so that this Cartesian question turns into a Kantian question. But in these essays, even here, you'll see a bit of an instability. It's a tendency to get the thing started in a Cartesian frame. Now, how it is that a Cartesian question could turn into a Kantian question, that's something I allowed myself to say. It's not something we've talked about at all in this class. So far, we've just said there's two kinds of problems. These Cartesian ones, these Kantian ones, there's some differences, there's some interesting similarities. We've just left it like that. We'll come back to that. But I just thought I'd mention, in Putnam's work, there's an increasing emphasis, as you go through the 80s and the early 90s, on Kantian problems. And that's something I think even at the time that was happening in Putnam's work. Not all of his readers really appreciated it. Maybe I'll give you one little reference. He has a collection of, well, there's two collections of essays of his papers that are actually edited by me, I'm afraid. So I'm not just an observer here, I'm participating in the crimes of philosophy. And the collection is called Words in Life, and it has an introduction. And if you look at pages, the introductory pages are in this funny Roman numbering, but if you look at pages 42 to 46, so that's just 5 pages. I try to give a description there of was clearly a certain kind of Kantian problem about the possibility of language, thought, judgment having content, that Putnam's extremely worried about in the essays that are collected in this book. This is now the early 90s, essays written in the late 80s, very beginning of the 90s. So you can see very clearly from some of the quotations I give in the material in Putnam I'm summarizing there that he's extremely worried at this point about Kantian questions, if you want evidence. There's some evidence. But now we want to talk about the Dewey Lectures and what happens to Putnam in the Dewey Lectures. One other piece of background which will matter for our class, which is that one of the things that happens to Putnam starting from the middle of the 1980s on the late 80s is he starts reading a lot of John McDowell. He becomes very impressed with John McDowell. Slowly, takes a while. There's various resistance to this, but he reads one thing he likes, he reads everything he likes. The first thing by McDowell he read that really gripped him, that he really liked, was McDowell's essay, Criteria to Feasibility in Knowledge. An essay we're going to talk about in this class. It's in your reader in a few meetings. One thing we're going to worry about is, when we get to it, I'm doing things in a funny order here, is what's the relationship between that essay and Mind and World? A more famous book that McDowell publishes around, I guess he publishes in 94, is that right? But people like McDowell had already read it before that, lectures he gave at Oxford. What happens is that Putnam's reading of Criteria to Feasibility and Knowledge controls his reading of Mind and World. I think it's true actually for a lot of people who are reading McDowell in a certain way. They read that early essay of his, they think they understand what his problems are, they read other things, and they try to fit it into their understanding of that early essay. When we get to that early essay, we'll see that it's very much worried about problems of a Cartesian form. It's particularly raising questions about philosophy of perception. And it's trying to show something about what I've been calling the Cartesian structure of a certain kind of format. So the assumption is that Mind and World has the same topic. And we have some of these words that we put on the board in the last couple of classes when we were looking at Price and Lewis and trying to see how we can get into trouble assimilating. Words like inside and outside. Words like reach all the way to, or make contact with, or directly present, something directly presenting itself to consciousness. All those kinds of expressions. And we show how they could shift from a Cartesian to a Kantian register. And in Mind and World, you do have McDowell using this imagery. I think he's using a way which is much more continuous in mind and world with the way Lewis is using it, rather than the way Price was using. The end of last class, we had some things on the board in connection with my lecture in Lewis, and I drew a circle and I called that the conceptual, and asked what's outside the boundary of the conceptual. And we had Lewis worried about how the given must be conceived of as outside of the boundary of the conceptual. There are sentences in Mind and Will which say things like this: the conceptual, the sphere of the conceptual is not bounded on the outside. It has no boundary. It is itself open to, another metaphor, not being bounded and open or flip. It's metaphors that are flip sides of each other to that which is given. Those metaphors are functioning in a Kantian register as he's picking up on a problem exactly like Lewis's. Not because he's read Lewis at that point necessarily, but because they're both working off of a certain understanding of what Kant's problem is. But Putnam picks this up and understands it in a different way. So that's what we're going to try to look at a bit today. First, let's look at how the Dewey lectures start and see what Putnam's trying to argue. Putnam is trying to say in the Dewey lectures, there's an assumption that has run through philosophy for the last 300 years. And it's responsible for all the fundamental problems. This is, not an unambitious little piece of work. It's really responsible for all of the problems in perception and philosophy. Perception, philosophy of language, philosophy of truth. Those are three areas he talks about most. Theories of truth, and we'll go third lecture. So in philosophical reflection, language, perception, language, and truth. Those are the three cases discussed the most, but he's, I think, suggesting even further. Certainly references to philosophy of mind, philosophy of cognitive science. He's saying there's an assumption that's responsible for all of the trouble. And all of these people are making this assumption. That's why they're in trouble. If they'd stop making this assumption, they wouldn't be in trouble. That's the rhetoric of the book. And the question is that going to work as a criticism of all of the figures he wants to criticize? My question is not, is this a good criticism of some of the people he wants to criticize? Perhaps it is. I'm not doubting that. The question is whether it has the generality he thinks it has. What's the assumption? Putnam calls it the interface conception. This is the crucial assumption. They have assumed an interface. And then the question really becomes, if this is the crucial assumption that's messed up philosophers in all areas of philosophy, that actually puts us in a position of wanting to know, well, what is the interface conception? Because we don't want to have it, because it's the thing that leads to all the trouble. And one of the things I want to say is that if you ask this question, it's very unclear what the interface conception is supposed to be, because I think it's trying to be more than one thing at once. I think to the extent that what the interface conception is supposed to be gets adumbrated in a way that's clear in Putnam's book, and this is mostly if you stick to the first lecture and a half, then the interface conception is going to come into view as an assumption that there is what I call in my previous classes a Cartesian gap. There's a gap that has a Cartesian structure, and there has to be something between the two sides of the gap. But we'll try that out. But Putnam also wants the interface conception to speak to lots of contemporary work that's being done on this problem, this language hook onto the word. And there, insofar as one can speak of a gap or an interface at all, it's not clear to me it any longer has the same structure. So, what is the interface conception? That's what we need to know. Second thing is, if you look at quotation, let's skip quotation one. I was going to say some things about Lewis to make for a better continuity between last class and this class, but having wasted so much time already, I think I'm going to skip that. Let's go to quotation two. You'll see he says, in McDowell's view, the key assumption responsible for the disaster is that the idea that there has to be an interface between our cognitive powers and the external world. So we've got various constraints on what the interface conception is supposed to be. One thing is it's supposed to be the assumption across all these different writings of these different people he's arguing with in contemporary philosophy. Another thing is it's an assumption that McDowell has identified. And it becomes clear if you read the Dewey lectures, he thinks, especially in Mind and World. That's the work of McDowell that he's working on, where McDowell has identified this assumption. So one question would be, is there something that's going to work the way Putnam thinks the interface conception works as an assumption that causes trouble, and something that is at the same time something that McDowell is identifying as the key assumption in Mind and World? Are those, as it were, co-satisfiable constraints on an interpretation of what the interface conception is? We won't really be able to answer that question until we look at McDowell. I want to plant the question now. What's the crucial assumption? Well, here's how he glosses it. The crucial assumption is that there's an interface between our cognitive powers and the external world. To get that clearer, he restates it. The idea that our cognitive powers cannot reach all the way to the objects themselves. So the crucial assumption is that this is a good question, and if the answer to this question is no, our cognitive powers, on their own steam, off their own back, by themselves, cannot reach all the way to the objects themselves. That's what the interface conception is. But then the question becomes, well, what does this mean? What does it mean to claim that the objects cannot reach all the way to themselves? What kind of philosophical assumption is that? And I think part of what happens in the Dewey lectures, if we had more time, I'd do this more slowly, but since we only have a class for Putnam and then we have to move on, I'm proceeding somewhat dogmatically. But you should read the Putnam and satisfy yourself as to the merits or lack thereof of what I'm saying. I think what you'll find is Putnam's construal of this issue has to waffle between a Cartesian and a Kantian construal of what the issue is, in order for it to both make contact with his initial construal and the kind of views he wants to put various people like John Austin, and the kind of connection he wants to make to McDowell's work in contemporary philosophy of language and his own work in contemporary philosophy of language at the same time. So, anyhow, let's not worry too much more about what this means right now. He just says, okay, boom, that's the interface conception. And you answer that question with a no. And he says, if we could overcome this assumption, then we could embrace with a sound philosophical conscience the natural realism of the common man. So here's another one of these phrases. The natural realism. The natural realism of the common man. That's a quotation, as it happens, from William James. William James, in some of his work, Philosophy of Perception, was railing against what he called idealism. That was a bad view. Thought his colleague Josiah Royce held it. He got it from people like Hegel. It's a feature of somebody like William James that he thought Berkeley's view wasn't all that different. Something that Royce would have contested. Those were all idealists. Bad view. It cuts us off from the objects, he thought. What we want, William James said, is to return to the natural realism of the common man. That's a phrase James could use. I don't think it's a way of speaking you'd find in John Austin. But somebody who's speaking in the name of Austin, as Putnam claims to be, might also use this phrase. Someone speaking in the name of Wittgenstein, as Putnam, I think, also takes himself to be doing here, might also use this phrase. As a gloss on something McDowell's doing in, say, Mind and World, you could use this phrase. I don't think any of those philosophers, as far as I can see, would have any particular need to disown the phrase. The question is, what does it mean? If it's the twin of this, if you think, well, there's this philosophical picture that doesn't let us get all the way to the objects themselves, but the natural realism of the common man is one. Before we had a certain philosophical problem, we thought our cognitive powers could. Then all of the ambiguity of what this means is built into this in an even more compressed way. What's the opposite of realism here? So this too is subject to the same waffle. So this is putting it in terms of a negative way, in terms of the, as it were, espousal and rejection of a skeptical position. This is a certain slogan that wants to deny that in the name of a certain kind of phenomenological naivete, or second naivete, return to naivete, Putnam will speak in philosophy. But all of the ambiguities that are swept under the rug here are still swept under the rug here. It's still a question about whether people who use these phrases are all talking about the same thing. I'm not doubting it might, in its vagueness, be equally apt for each of them. I'm not trying to say something like, Wittgenstein is, but William James isn't really speaking for the natural. That's not the point here. The point is what the issue is. That there's a joining of a common philosophical problematic of the same shape. Can't be deduced from the fact that within philosophy of perception, this banner is one that you can raise up over what a certain philosopher is doing. Now, I say that even though, and there might be a lot that's true of these different philosophers, James, Austin, Putnam, so forth. I mean, the kind of thing Putnam says in the Dewey Lectures, and would want to say, and says elsewhere, is, look, you don't understand me if you think natural realism here is a label for a philosophical position. When I defend this, I'm not defending a philosophical position. I'm trying to explode a certain philosophical confusion. Once the philosophical confusion is exploded, we can go back to saying what we previously were able to say before we were confused. So it's not meant to be a label for a position, something more familiar, a kind of way that Putnam talks at a different point, echoing another kind of philosophers, to say something like this is an attempt to explicate and rescue something like our pre-philosophical understanding of certain matters. Our understanding of our, if you will, cognitive powers, or our cognitive relation to the world prior to its corruption by a certain kind of philosophy. And then there might be a view about what's corrupted us, whether it's the scientific revolution or something bigger than that, or something. Rorty thinks it's, ultimately certain theological assumptions. Somebody else might think it's something much more local that happened in 20th century philosophy. But the point is that all of that could be true across different uses of this slogan. And this slogan still is going to be just as unclear as a way of picking out what the philosophical issues are as this slogan is. Because the one is still the denial of the other. Unless we're clear about what the shape of the philosophical issue is, we're not sure whether we're really talking about the same thing when two people say that. So what Putnam notices in McDowell is that McDowell is interested in an issue that looks like it can be summed up by arguing with somebody who wants to answer no to this question. But McDowell wants to deny that. So McDowell is saying something that looks like you could sum up this way. Even if McDowell doesn't use quite this quotation from William James. McDowell does talk about common sense and certain things being truisms that philosophy has made it hard for us to grasp. And Putnam uses all of that as a sign that he and McDowell are saying the same thing in philosophy of perception. And so part of my point is those are completely unreliable signs. At that level, two philosophers can't tell whether they're saying the same thing about this kind of issue. Now, a little more about Putnam. Putnam thinks you can't just say, with respect to this issue, here too, there's agreement between him and McDowell across the disagreement. There's a kind of methodological agreement between Putnam and McDowell. Whatever this question means, neither of them think that it's a satisfying answer to somebody who thinks, no, our cognitive powers cannot reach all the way objects themselves. Say, yes, it can. Remember what the natural man thinks. Hooray for the natural man. We should think what the natural man says. We stand with him. This is the philosophical party of the natural man. Vote for us. Forget about those people. Neither of them think that's going to work. They think, once you got this problem, it's not enough to just remind people what we'd ordinarily say. So they're trying to distinguish themselves from another kind of philosopher they might look like. So they both think we need to figure out why it has seemed compelling to deny this. We need to understand why our philosophical consciences are troubled, so it no longer looks like you can just say, yes, our cognitive powers do reach. And so that's the point in Putnam of saying we must excavate the interface conception. See that this has become a tempting assumption and get rid of it, because that will allow us then to make this return to the natural realism of the common man. So he doesn't want to just be sort of an ostrich burying his head in the sand, ignoring all of the problems in philosophy. He wants to be solving them by pointing out there's this assumption which, if you can get it clear and out in the open enough, looks very unattractive. And then if you don't make it, you don't have the problems. And again, I want to say, for all of their differences, I'm going to try to point out, methodologically, Putnam and McDowell are doing something similar there. But they have a very different issue that they've got their teeth into across the Dewey Lectures in Mind and World. How am I doing for time? Good, a few minutes. Okay. So that's one thing we want to see. Another thing we want to see when we look at this is that I think the Putnam-McDowell case, if you read the Dewey Lectures and you read Mind and World, you read the Dewey Lectures again, maybe you read Mind and World again, get to the point where you understand both of those books well, and you really have the words in them, you have a very nice illustration of something I think happens all the time in philosophy, but I think this is a nice example of it, which is you will notice that many, many phrases, forms of words, whole sentences from Mind and World occur in the Dewey Lectures. There's a lot of paraphrase of McDowell in the Dewey Lectures. He's just read it. It's not plagiarism. He's very open about how much he owes McDowell. He's got footnotes in some places. I'm sure he doesn't know exactly when he's ventriloquizing and when he doesn't, but he's certainly not trying to hide the fact that he's been very influenced by John McDowell. Great man, John McDowell. Great book, Mind and World. Read it. And there's many, many phrases, including this. This itself, well, here in the quotation it makes it sort of clear. It's sort of an echo of McDowell's here. But all over the place, there are these echoes of McDowell. And the reason I've chosen this example is because what I want to say is that although he's in some sense quoting McDowell perfectly, he's completely misrepresenting his view. Because what happens to all of these McDowellian phrases he's quoting through most of the Dewey Lectures is that they're getting shoehorned into a Cartesian problematic, in which what they mean is something quite different than what McDowell's trying to say in Mind and World. So this is a slightly more extreme case of something I tried to show you before. Before I showed you a case drawn from Lewis and Price. I could have taken other examples, but Lewis and Price, where you had many sentences in common, but they were talking about something different. They were talking about objects presenting themselves to consciousness and trying to isolate the given, and the given being something that, and so forth. And showing you that actually they're talking about very different things. That the words are the same and some of the sentences are the same. But here we have a slightly more extreme case because we have one guy actually quoting and paraphrasing the other guy. He's just trying to say what he said. And of course, on one criterion of saying what he said, he's doing great. That is, if you want to check the quotations, in some cases, he hasn't moved the words around. Here, the measure of saying what he said isn't whether he put the same words. I mean, it isn't. If McDowell said, do our cognitive powers make contact with the objects themselves rather than reach the objects themselves, that wouldn't be the measure of whether he's getting McDowell right or not. You could paraphrase either way. The question is, what does reach or make contact mean? What's the philosophical issue? And I think this happens all the time in philosophy. You have philosophers who take themselves to be influenced by philosophers, paraphrasing them perfectly. I think Kant himself is a great example. Those people are explicating Kant, but Wittgenstein is another example. But completely changing what all of the words mean, while quoting it perfectly, by having restructured the philosophical context in which the phrases are operating. So I think it's a particularly interesting case of something I'm trying to illuminate through this one pair of examples of Cartesian and Kantian problems, is the way in which you can have systematic failure of understanding of philosophy. But you can't locate it the way we're often taught to locate understanding. You can't use even faithful paraphrase and quotation as a measure of understanding. One of the problems in philosophy, this is why encyclopedia articles are so useless. They write an encyclopedia entry in Kant's philosophy. And there's a sense in the whole thing can be a pastiche of Kant. But the whole thing can also be a complete misunderstanding of Kant that it's setting up. But in the way in which it's encouraging you to understand all of those sentences, which are pastiche from Kant, that are occurring in the encyclopedia article. Okay, so that's what we're going to want to look at when we come back. See you in 10 minutes. Let me just make explicit something that I'm doing in this meeting, in the next meeting, in the class. I'm doing something rather unusual, pedagogically. We'll see if it works. Which is I'm talking about Putnam's reading of McDowell before we talk about McDowell. It's not bad organization. Doing it on purpose. It might be a bad idea, but it's not just bad organization. The reason for that is because I think it's hard to read McDowell, and I think there's an extremely natural misreading of it, which becomes extremely vivid and explicit in Putnam. So I don't think Putnam is making a stupid mistake. He's falling into a way of understanding what McDowell's doing that is out there more or less in a lot of the literature, more or less inchoately. And the nice thing about the Putnam is it's happening in a vivid enough way that one can see the problems with it. And so part of the point of doing that is that when we turn to the McDowell, and hopefully you're still reading the McDowell for Wednesday, you're worried about how you're understanding what you're reading as you're reading it. Trying to warn you up, a very natural way of picking up. So it seems that it's clear what he's doing, it's very familiar. But that's because you're actually refracting the whole thing through a Cartesian lens, which you yourself have acquired in even just the few philosophy courses you've taken. Because that's what tends to happen, especially in early philosophy courses, is we're exposed to philosophical problems often that have some Cartesian shape. Not necessarily, it depends who your teacher is, what you've learned, what kind of course you come in, but often that's what happens. So that's part of the strategy here. So I'm going to be saying things about McDowell before you've read him, or before we're talking about him explicitly in a textual way, which I want you to go out and test in your own reading of him. So that's one thing we're doing at a more textual level. At a more systematic level, independently of the particular philosophers we're looking at, Putnam and McDowell, I'm interested in bringing out for you how words that express certain kinds of philosophical words or philosophical positions by answering certain philosophical questions themselves can have a kind of instability built into them, or at least an instability in different people's understandings of what the issues are, depending upon how they waffle with respect to the issues we're discussing here. This is only an example of this, but it's a particularly good example. And we had these two questions: how does language hook onto the world? Do our cognitive powers reach all the way to the objects themselves? And I'm now putting the board two more examples of such questions slash assertions slash quotations, which I think are all sort of in the same basket. That is, your understanding of any of these is such that your understanding of the others will probably take in the washing of the others. So that, but just to show you how these things spread. Number 3, I've written really small. So you might think you can't read it, but it's on your handout. So you can read it off your handout. I just wanted it on the board so I could point to it. It's a quotation from Wittgenstein. When we say and mean that such and such is the case, we in our meaning do not stop anywhere short of the fact. And for the moment in today's lecture, or today's presentation, I want to bracket even any discussion, the context this comes up in Wittgenstein. Maybe what Wittgenstein meant by this is something completely different. Let's not even worry about that. It suffices for my purposes today. It's enough trouble if we can see that Putnam and McDowell are putting this quotation to completely different uses. That will be enough to make my point for today. What might someone mean by these words is enough of an issue for us to get started today. We have, again, do not stop anywhere short of the fact. That could be taken to be some version of this question. The cognitive power here is our ability to say things or ability to mean things. Does that stop short of the things we say and mean? Or does it not stop anywhere short? Does it go all the way too? Whatever that picture means here, that could be taken to be a version of this. You've got some specification now. We're talking about saying and meaning. We're not just talking vaguely about cognitive powers. Does that make a difference or not? Here's another kind of issue. Is blah, blah, blah responsible to reality? Very common kind of issue in philosophy. A lot of philosophy of mathematics, starting with a famous essay by the philosopher and mathematician J.H. Harding, is about, are mathematical claims responsible to any reality? You say 2 plus 2 equals 4. Are you just playing some self-contained mathematical game? The truth of those things just followed from the axioms and the rules of inference? Or is there some further notion of mathematical truth that goes beyond bare consistency? Or the mathematical claims themselves, if you're doing the real stuff, are true? And then that looks like it means true of something. True of what? True of the empirical world? Well, that looks like it's going to get into a bit of trouble. So, true to a non-empirical world? Some people have said yes, but it's hard to find that non-empirical world. If you bounce sound waves off it, it looks like it was empirical after all. If you can't bounce anything off it, what is it? So, there's a question we want to ask here. Hardy tries to put it carefully, without any commitments, by saying, are they responsible to reality? To some different reality? Do they have some barriers? Is there some way in which, when you're getting things right in mathematics, there's a sense of getting right that goes beyond playing a mathematical game? So this is a kind of phrase that comes up a lot in philosophy. That's one context. Putnam's Dewey lectures start. Quotation 4. Sorry, my pagination is from the reprinted version of them in the threefold court. And since I learned that I can't put more than one chapter of a book in without violating Norwegian copyright law, but if it's in the Journal of Philosophy, I can put 3 lectures in it. It doesn't matter because it's not a book. I took it from the Journal of Philosophy, so I could give you the whole thing. But so then I realized I was giving you the wrong pagination. But, it's going to be roughly page 4 in the Journal of Philosophy, which is quite early. Putnam starts out by asking, he's warming up to this claim that it's all about the interface conception. By page 10, we've reached this climax. But on page 4, he sets up his issue by saying, are our knowledge claims responsible to reality? That looks like the question. And I picked that phrase because this kind of language also occurs in McDowell, in Mind and World. It's an issue about the responsibility, or as he sometimes puts it, vulnerability of claims to reality. McDowell doesn't say knowledge claims. Is that just a little bit of detail or not? Come to that in a second. But so these are, I want to say, further examples of places where philosophers can go, oh yes, I think that's the issue. Oh yes, I think that's the right answer. And what you have is apparent agreement. What you have between McDowell and Putnam here is, I think, a spectacular case of nearly apparent agreement in philosophy. A few classes will look at an equally spectacular case of merely apparent disagreement. 2 philosophers, I think, aren't disagreeing about anything, but boy, are they ready to kill each other over the fact that one of them is willing to affirm a sentence that has the form of one the other is willing to deny. Okay, so let's get a little further into this. So This is a quotation from Wittgenstein. It figures prominently, as you'll see, in Mind and World. I think it's quoted on page 27. But it's a sort of touchstone for something McDowell wants to say, which he thinks, faced with a certain kind of philosophical bind, we're forced to deny. McDowell would take what Wittgenstein's saying here, if this helps any, this may be going a bit fast, but McDowell would take, on his understanding of what Wittgenstein's saying here, to be a way of disagreeing with the first quotation on your handout last time from C.I. Lewis, where C.I. Lewis said, neither the given and the pure concept limit one another. I'm sorry, the pure concept and the given do limit one another. No, neither one determines one another. So neither one limits one another. So there's that space we had on the board. There must be a kind of independence, Lewis thought, in order for knowledge to have content. And McDowell is going to take himself to be disagreeing with that. So to be disagreeing with a very fundamental assumption, which he thinks Wittgenstein would want to disagree with. If that wasn't helpful, don't worry about it. We'll come back to it. But the main thing we want for right now is just, here's something Wittgenstein says McDowell agrees with. It's the kind of sentence in McDowell, while Putnam's saying this about the interface conception, and starting his book with item 4 in your handout saying, are our knowledge claims responsible to reality? Yes, they are. This is what the interface conception does not allow us to see. He'll read a sentence like this in Putnam. Putnam's agreeing with it. In McDowell, and McDowell's agreeing with it and think, yes, we're on the same page. And indeed, it's even more extreme here. Putnam takes himself to be explaining McDowell to us, not just finding agreement, but to be actually spelling out McDowell's views. So, Putnam wants, here's a way of bringing out the problem very vividly, the kind of waffle. The interface conception says, our cognitive powers cannot reach all the way to themselves, to the objects themselves. That's what the interface conception says. Putnam wants to deny that. He wants to assert the negation of what a holder of the interface conception says. Inserting the negation of that, he wants to be doing two things at once. He wants to be saying, this Cartesian assumption is a bad thing. It's the cause of our philosophical problems, and we're saying no to it. That's one thing he wants to be doing. Second thing he wants to be doing is agreeing with what McDowell was saying when he quotes Wittgenstein here in his understanding. He wants to be saying, yes, they can reach all the way to themselves. Our cognitive powers can. When we say it means something's the case, it doesn't stop anywhere short of the fact. He wants the negation. He wants the positive answer to this question, the negation to what the interface conception asserts, to both be doing both those things at once. That's a way of trying to bring out something he wants them saying he can't have. That there's a waffle there. He can overthrow the interface conception and his understanding of it, and he can agree with McDowell. But those aren't the same philosophical issue. There isn't anything which is saying one thing in one set of sentence, which is doing both those things at once. It's not that those things are incompatible. It's just that those are two different kinds of philosophical work, which he's running together at the same time. There's kind of unclarity about what the issue is. And it's quite clear that he wants us to take it both ways, as I'll try to show you. The point of quotation 4, where the word Cartesian even figures, is that he wants the negation of this, the negation of the skeptic's answer to this question, to be refusal of Cartesian assumption. And it's also quite clear he wants to be agreeing with McDowell when McDowell says that kind of thing. If you read the Dewey lectures, it's quite clear that he wants to be doing both those things at once. He doesn't take that to be doing two different things. Okay. Now, to actually prove that this is a big confusion in 30 minutes, 35 minutes, maybe more than I can do. Mostly what I'm giving you is a template for reading this with a certain critical eye yourself. But let me make some remarks that can help you start to smell the trouble here if you're looking for it. Notice first one kind of slippage, which I've already briefly drawn attention to. Might put an extra parenthesis here. Putnam says, are our knowledge claims responsible to reality? That's the question he is taking up explicitly. He won't do it like this, he says. McDowell, in Mind and World, is interested in what it would be for claims to be responsible to reality. Now, you might think the difference there is one just of generality. McDowell's interested in more kinds of claims than Putnam. Putnam's only focusing on knowledge claims. McDowell's asking the same question. He's asking about maybe other kinds of claims besides knowledge claims or something. But no, I don't think that's the difference. The difference is in what this bit here winds up meaning. With the difference in question comes a difference with issue. McDowell's problem, I'm sorry, let's start with Putnam. Putnam's problem, are knowledge claims responsible to reality? Is what he means to be explicitly taking up a certain kind of problem in Cartesian philosophy of perception that we've already talked a lot about. Here I am, standing in front of the classroom. I have a perceptual basis for claiming I'm in front of the classroom. But if there's no way to distinguish between I'm dreaming I'm in front of the classroom, I'm in front, and my being in front of the classroom, then my knowledge claim, based on my perceptual experience, is only answerable to how things seem. The basis for the claim is locked within a self-contained perceptual space. How reality is blankly obtains, to borrow a phrase from the other McDowell essay that Putnam read earlier and made such an impression on him. How reality is blankly obtains over and beyond anything that my claim is based on. My claim looks like it's only responsible to my perception. It looks like it can't be responsible to reality. Even on Descartes' refutation of skepticism, it's only because God is not a deceiver, and he designed us, and he designed reality, and he made the whole thing fit, that it turns out that my claim, which is based on my perception, turns out to also be responsible to reality. That's, as it were, a function of the fortuitous wiring of the whole setup because of our benevolent designer. But the claim itself is only based on how things seem, on my clear and distinct ideas. I can't get beyond those. Putnam says, what's the mistake? The mistake is this gap, where we think that perception itself is this self-contained realm. We need to get rid of that assumption. We need our claim to be based on, now let's use a word that will come up in McDowell's Mind and World too, another world that can shift around. Open to. Our perception is open to reality itself. Putnam wants to say, in the perceptually veridical case, when I hear believe that I'm standing in front of a room full of people, because I perceive it. The basis of my claim is the room full of people. It's not a mere perception, that, such and such. So I want to say the claim is based on reality. There is no perceptual interface that is the same in the case of the veridical perception and the non-veridical perception. There's always a perceptual interface. Something coming between me and reality. When I make a knowledge claim, is the crucial assumption. Now, if you read McDowell's criteria to feasibility of knowledge, which you will do if you've never done it before this class is over, you'll see that McDowell can agree with all of that. But he also says this is not an interpretation of mind and world. It's not the point of what I'm doing in this book. You've misunderstood it. So that's what Putnam means. That's a very quick way to try to bring out that something Putnam's trying to say when he says, are our knowledge claims responsible to reality? But notice, it depends on knowledge claims, on the veridical perceptions being responsible to reality. Responsible to reality here means directly in touch with, without a perceptual interface, and therefore true. So, on this understanding of responsible to reality, if I'm dreaming, then my perceptual experience is not responsible to reality. And it's not a knowledge claim. He's only saying about the knowledge claims can be responsible to reality. He's not saying the dreams are. Responsible here is a term that's sorting the true from the false. The ones where we are open to reality in this sense. There is no perceptual distraction in the form of dream or hallucination, and ones who are not. When McDowell asked the question, are our claims responsible to reality? What he wants to know is, to borrow another way McDowell puts it, how is it that our claims can so much as have empirical content? If I make a claim, I'm standing in front of a class, how is that the kind of thing that could be true or false? That comes up about the true ones and the false ones. That comes up about the claim that's contained in my dream, just as much as the claim that's contained in my waking state. If we didn't have that kind of responsibility to reality, to go back to that quotation from the A deduction of Kant's, then experience would be less than a dream. Here, responsibility to reality, that's why you can substitute claims for thoughts in McDowell. How is it that our thoughts can so much as be responsible to reality, have a bearing on reality, be vulnerable such they turn out to be true or false in the light of how things are? Whereas Putnam's question isn't how our thoughts can be responsible to reality, and his use of the term responsible to reality, it's how can our true thoughts be responsible to reality, in the sense in which he's using it. This phrase, responsible to reality, does not mean the same thing in Putnam and McDowell, because the issue is not the same. It sounds very, it's the same, similar as an understatement. You can use the same words to ask both their questions. So it can sound identical in the sense of mere sound, but it doesn't make it the same issue. It has the same structure. So the very fact that there's this emphasis on knowledge would be, to McDowell, a sign that something's probably already gone wrong in Putnam's explication of McDowell's mind and world. McDowell is constantly talking about claims. Any claims. How can they have the content they do? McDowell's emphasizing. So that's one way you can see it. Another way you can see the difference in spin is by looking at the Wittgenstein quotation that McDowell wants to emphasize. This is the kind of quotation McDowell used to set up his problem. The issue is, how can what we say and mean fall anywhere short of the fact? That fits better with the McDowell construal. Wittgenstein's question isn't obviously, at least it isn't on McDowell's understanding of how can it be when we say and mean that such and such is the case, if what we say is true, that it stop, that it not stop anywhere short of the fact. There's no suppressed clause here, if what we say is true. The question is, how can what we say and mean be such that it has that kind of bearing on reality, true or false? If I say there are weapons of mass destruction, how can I say the kind of thing that can be overturned or not? That's how McDowell understands the issue here. And so the emphasis being on meaning rather than knowledge brings out the issue of what kind of cognitive power this is issue here is quite different. On the initial Putnam construal, the cognitive power that's at issue here is knowledge. The cognitive power, for instance, of doubting isn't in question. It's a certain kind of Cartesian doubt we're trying to overthrow by saying we are in touch. No need to doubt. That's what the refusal of the interface conception is doing. For Putnam, at least the beginning of the lectures. Whereas in McDowell, the kind of cognitive powers that are issue are meaning, first and foremost, claiming. He'll say something's barren. But with it, therefore, claims that express doubts. Doubting, too. How can those things have the kind of determinate content that they do? That's the issue in McDowell. It's a different issue. So, now it doesn't, I want to be clear, it doesn't follow just the fact that he's used this word and he's used this word. That's a different issue. But I do think you can see a difference in emphasis here. And if you read around, you'll see that this difference of emphasis is not an accident, but it fits with the overall problematics they have. Yes?
I want to ask you to give an answer to this problem.
Which problem?
That he's confusing the diffusion and content in McDowell.
You mean if I get Putnam clear about...
give a response to your reading of him.
Yeah. Not one that I found very satisfying.
Okay.
But he hasn't given anything in print that I've seen. Here's a non-encouraging sign. He's published a reply to McDowell. Since he and I have talked about all of this in a book called, I can't remember what it's called. What's that book called? Edited by Nicholas.
Reading McDowell's Mind and World.
Reading McDowell's Mind and World. So it's an anthology called Reading Mind and World, which contains an essay from McDowell, an essay from Putnam, which has criticisms of McDowell that I think turn on the same misreading, in part. I mean, there's other criticisms that are just wrong for other reasons. But we also talked about those. So that might suggest that I haven't convinced him of much. On the other hand, he has said things like, yes, I know you're right. I have to be careful not to confuse Cartesian and Kantian skepticism and so forth. And I have been at conferences and things. And he'll say, yes, well, Conant has pointed out that we must not confuse these things, blah, 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 blah. But then sometimes he'll go on and say things that I think still involve that confusion. And then if I raise my hand and say, well, I've already agreed with you that of course it's important not to confuse these things. The problem in philosophy is it's much harder to actually avoid making certain mistakes than it is to just agree that they are mistakes. McDowell's criticism of Sellars is that he commits the myth of the given. There's nothing Sellars is more worried about than the myth of the given. One of Wittgenstein's central criticisms of Frege is that he falls into psychologism. There's nothing that Frege is more interested in doing than avoiding psychologism. So this is what happens in philosophy. It's not enough for some philosopher to say, well, yes, I agree that we want to avoid this mistake. If it's a really deep and interesting philosophical mistake, your desire not to commit it. It's sort of like every time you get in your car saying, I promise I will never get into a traffic accident. Well, why not get you there? The sincerity of your intention notwithstanding. Philosophical traffic accidents occur even in the face of that. So I think my sense of Putnam is, yeah, he thinks there's a point here. Maybe he made a problem. He committed a mistake with respect to it. He needs to sort these things out. But he's not sure how deep it goes. And from my point of view, he hasn't really gotten a hold of it because he keeps falling back into it. But as you'll see, we're just starting by really focusing on Putnam. But I'm going to raise issues about McDowell too, and whether he's got this under control as well. So I think, if I'm right about the way in which one can lapse into a certain kind of confusion because the philosophical vocabulary we use is so easily slides from one issue to another that we get into trouble, then it's going to come up a lot. It's not that Putnam is particularly unique here. I'm just choosing an essay. There's lots of things of Putnam's I could have chosen where I don't think he is sliding around. He's got a firm grip on a particular philosophical issue he's talking about, and he's just talking about that one. It's because he's trying in these lectures to do something very synthetic and to connect lots of things and say, this is the fundamental problem in perception and language, then and now, that he gets into trouble, I think. But I guess the real answer is you'd have to let Hilary speak for himself. If he were here right now, I really don't know what he would say. I think he'd be something like, yeah, Jim's got an important point here, but I think he exaggerates it. He'd probably say something like that. We did have a big argument about, we did have an argument with Hilary about quotation 5 in your handout, which we're about to go through. We won't get to it for another minute, but I'll just say this in connection to your question. And what do you want to say about quotation 5 is, as you'll see in quotation 5, just so it doesn't take too long, I was giving a lecture sort of like what I'm doing in this class. I had the quotation just the way it is now, with a lot of dots. That is, what I've given you here is about a paragraph worth. It takes place over 3.5 pages of Putnam's lectures. And Putnam said, the reason it looks like there's a problem here is because you've left out all of this text in between. And if we added all of that text, then you'd see that I haven't, gotten myself into the trouble you said. And I did sit down with Hilary once, and we went through those 3.5 pages with all of the text, and he agreed it didn't help at all. If there wasn't a problem, he wasn't going to fix it by adding that text. So we've had some discussions like that, But, in philosophy, it's hard work, If you say someone's got a mistake and they think they haven't got a mistake, it's not always easy to figure out who's right. What we decided is that adding all of that text didn't help him. He agreed to that. But then he said, well, if you read the rest of the lectures, you'll see, actually, if you read the Dewey lectures, I can't remember, but I think there's a footnote early on where I'm thanked very much for my comments. It's on the first page. I was raising these questions, before he published them. And then he said, well, I fixed all of the problems. And then he published them and thanked me for, sort of like, McDowell's on my side. Jim Conant's on my side, too. Hilary, I want to be on your side. I love you. But you didn't fix the problem. So, so the conversation goes on. I'm trying to recover my sense of where we are. So meaning, knowledge. We talked about that. So, I was talking about how the phrase responsibility to reality is another one of these phrases we could have put on the board when we had all those quotations on the board when we were looking at Price and Lewis, of phrases that can move back and forth between the different registers and function quite differently, depending upon which one they're in. If you're in the Kantian problematic, of the sort that McDowell's worrying about, the kind of responsibility or vulnerability to reality, to borrow Kant's word, the kind of objektive Gültigkeit, the kind of objective validity or purport, that kind of bearing to reality, that's at issue there. We must capitalize our nouns in German. Is one where the issue concerns true claims and false claims, valid perceptual experiences and dreams, knowledge and doubt. Statements that are true and false, they are equally meaningful. It's the conditions of meaning something at all that's at issue. I think, indeed, this is often a way in which both Kant and Wittgenstein are misunderstood. It's not just happening in Putnam. Very often when people talk about, say, rule following, they'll talk about the conditions under which the application of this concept is true. It's a very common way of phrasing what the rule following problematic's about. How can we know our use of the concept's true? What's the rule following problem? How do I know when I call something red's red? What are the cases in which using this word, is being predicated the right sort of thing? So the whole thing is starting to take a shape of, how do I pick out the true cases from the other cases? I think in Wittgenstein, not always, he's concerned with issues about knowledge in certain places, but always against the background of his more fundamental concerns. Same in Kant, he's concerned with Cartesian problematics in certain places, but always against the background of his more fundamental concern with what I'm calling Kantian skepticism. The fundamental issue in Wittgenstein, usually in the first instance, is with meaning. How can our words mean something? Is thinking that you mean something enough to know that you mean something? What do you have to do with words such that there could be correctness or incorrectness? What does it take for there to be a language game to play? Play it badly, but it's there to be played. That's usually the first level of issue. The issue isn't how do we know we're using it truthfully. Yes?
Just a small question about the German word Gültigkeit.
Yeah.
We have the word in Norwegian as well, Gültighet.
Uh-huh.
Much the same thing. And it normally means truth, not false.
Right.
So you say validity or purport. Where do you get the purport
from this? That is, the issue in Kant is how can it have how can it be putting forward something that has an objective bearing? Mm-hmm. So how can there be a difference between, the kind of issue Kant's worried about, say in section 19, is if I say this stone is heavy, just connecting one sensation with another sensation, and saying something that has the form of a judgment. I'm not just connecting two things in me, but as he puts it, I'm connecting two representations in the object. That's the so subjective validity has to do with things seeming this way to me.
But you said that the Cartesian problematic had to do with how true propositions, or what kind of bearing true proposition have on reality. And
well, would be
true.
Well, that's a very vague way of putting it, because then the bearing in reality, what you're doing is you're taking a phrase, bearing in reality, the kind of Kantian phrase, and you're shoving it back into a Cartesian format where you're giving it a different kind of content. What the Cartesian is interested in is, how do I know among my claims which of them is true? What you're interested in, if you're interested in the fundamental Kantian question, is how can I claim something that has the form of a judgment? That when I say the two concepts are related, I say S is phi, I'm saying something that has the form of a judgment. That could be right or wrong. That could involve, bringing intuitions to the synthetic unity of consciousness, as Kant says, section 19 of the B deduction. Now, you can take the word bearing and drop it in the middle of either of those problematics. But I'm saying it's functioning differently.
Yeah, but I want to raise a question about the translation of Gültigkeit.
Right.
And it seems to me that the translation.
Well, my claim is not. My claim is not.
The purport seems to fit your.
Well, I'm saying when Kant's concerned with this issue, he's concerned with an issue about how we are able to have judgments that have this kind of bearing. But I'm not making a translational issue about any word in Kant. I don't think a good way to read Kant is to try to figure out, what he means by Vorstellung, by first looking at, a general German dictionary, Ich möchte ihm vorstellen. I would like to introduce you to Richard. That's not a good way to start asking the question, what the scope of that concept is. So I'm not making a translational claim about German that, sure, the word Gültigkeit, has all of the scope of a word like, gültig means valid, or something counts. This currency, is valid in this country, and so forth. It has a huge scope of meaning. I don't think we can figure out what Kant's issue is by working off of that word. Just the verb gelten, to count or be valid. But I am saying that the issue that Kant's worried about here is one that is more closely related to the kind of topic that McDowell is finding in Wittgenstein than the topic that Putnam is finding in Descartes. That's what I want to say. But I also was trying to say that it's not forced by any of these words. The word mean, itself has different things. One of the things you can mean by the word mean is not how can I come up with a statement that has the kind of form that's true or false? X is 5. One of the things you can mean by mean is, I mean my mother. You can have what's called objectual meaning. So we're not concerned with, as Frege would put it, the Sinn of a proposition, but we're concerned with the Bedeutung of a term. And then that is picking out a particular. And that gets into, a different... So I'm not saying this word forces that issue either. We will never be able to... I want one of my morals to be, you can't tell what the issue is from the words alone. But if you look at how the words spread and how the issue unfolds, and you have a whole set of features, and it has certain logic, then you can start to see what the philosophical issues are. But part of my point is that whole sentences, any of these sentences, can slide between the problematic. I'm not saying there's some words that sort of have Kantian or Cartesian bear, sort of stamped on their trademark. So if they slide over there, there's a problem. It's not. It really, unfortunately, is much harder than that. I really don't want to be claiming that. And so not for this word either. Not for any word will I claim that. Alas. 10 minutes left. I have to make some decisions. Let's look at the quotation. Quotation 5. Let's now ask why realism about the external world came to seem problematic. Early modern philosophers, it's quotation 5, early modern philosophers assumed that the immediate objects of perception were mental, and that mental objects were non-physical. What is more, even their materialist opponents put forward accounts of perception that closely paralleled these Cartesian accounts. So, we've clearly got a setup here where the initial problem, it happens really fast, as we saw it did in the Price. It's assuming familiarity with a kind of background in philosophy. But I think it's fairly clear the background in philosophy we're supposed to be familiar with here is one of a Cartesian construal of the problem. And one of the things you can see here is how dangerous it is in philosophy. In physics, if people have taken introductory Newtonian mechanics and solid state physics and electromagnetism, then you can start teaching relativity theory. And you can start saying, well, the problem in relativity theory is how do we unify our account of mechanical phenomena and electromagnetic phenomena. And the student's supposed to know what that is and that is, because they took previous courses. And the fantasy in philosophy is we can do the same thing. We can start saying, I want to start talking about materialism, and I refer back to a certain problem. You've all already studied. But the problem in philosophy is, where was that problem we already studied? If you do it quickly, there's a lot of philosophical unclarity that can immediately creep in. You actually have to know, I think in philosophy, who his teacher was, they used the textbook, what the textbook was, what actually were they, what did they think that problem was? There isn't anything which stands to introductory philosophy as Newtonian mechanics stands to introductory physics. So we can just go to, advance. If you have a very sort of ideologically regimented philosophy department where everybody shares a common conception of the subject, then you can take the introductory course at Princeton and the intermediate course, but then go to some other department and start talking. And then you conclude, well, those guys are stupid. They don't know what serious philosophy are, which is what philosophers often conclude about each other when they change departments. So, very quickly, we're pointing at some issue, which is supposed to be a fundamental issue. It's pretty clear, I think, that it's meant to here have a Cartesian shape for Putnam, even apart from his using the word Cartesian, which I don't want to itself, be playing a role of knockout evidence here. And then he's saying, well, the problem in contemporary science is the fashion to hypothesize the existence of representations in the cerebral computer. If one assumes that the mind is an organ, one goes to identify the mind with the brain, it will then become irresistible to think of some of the representations as analogous to the classical theorist's impressions, and to think that those impressions are linked to objects in the organism's environment, not only causally, but cognitively. Now, one of the things I should tell you here is, the life is so complicated that the following is true. Putnam is here reciting things that McDowell says. Early McDowell. There's not only criteria to feasibility knowledge, but there are other essays. One essay that's somewhat later, but it's quite relevant, is an essay McDowell's called The Content of Perceptual Experience. So, which I can't remember which of his 2 volumes that's in right now. I think it's at the end of the Mind Value Reality one.
It is, but it doesn't make it easier because that's a quite late essay.
No, it's quite less essay, but they're not
It's written about the same time as one wrote.
Right now, but it's, well, it depends what late here means. If late means date of publication, yes.
Yeah, okay.
But it's a kind of, it's material he's thinking about for a long time. One of the things that McDowell does, which makes it hard to date his stuff, is he has certain lectures he gives for years because he needs to have a lecture to give. And then finally he agrees to publish it. So there's certain essays that were published after Mind and World, like his essay in the Davidson Festschrift. But it's about 12 years earlier, and that's actually the seed out of which Mind and World grew. So I think the dating can't be just a function of publication date. And also, as we'll see, when we look at McDowell, he thinks there is a connection between these 2 problematics. So it's not that he's lost interest in one and switched to the other. He's got an overall view of how these things hang together. All I'm saying is you can't use some of the things he says about that Cartesian problematic as a lens for just reading Mind and World, or you go wrong. And I think McDowell would agree with that. But what you do have, but what McDowell would be perfectly happy with, as we'll see, whether he's right or wrong about this, is that in the Cartesian format, you have an assumption of what McDowell calls inner space. You have an assumption of a certain kind of self-standing realm. In philosophy of perception, the self-standing realm is sort of the perceptual, how things seem to me. And it's that hypostatization of the perceptual disconnected from what the content of perception is, the objects. That's the crucial mistake. That's what he thinks is the crucial mistake. And so, from McDowell's point of view, then assuming the representations, so understood, are something material rather than something mental, just keeps that assumption in place. The self-standingness of the realm, that the representations could all have of this content, simply by taking place, simply by following each other in the physical space instead of the mental space, hasn't been attacked. What we tried to get out of the problem by treating a symptom of the problem, which seems ontologically fishy about the space of representation, that it's mental, while holding the crucial assumptions, which we might call, Putnam calls it the interface conception. I think McDowell would be happier with calling the crucial assumption here something like the self-standingness of inner space, or the Cartesian conception of mental, that is, having a gap. Putnam makes it sort of sound like the description of the 2 sides is fine. The problem is the idea of an interface. Let's just move them closer together so they touch. Let's just change the geometry of the picture, and everything will be all right. Whereas I think McDowell might be happier to put the objection a slightly different way. But what's certainly right is that Putnam could cite McDowell, the idea that the assumption that mind is an organ, that is, to say it's an organ is a way of taking its capacities to be self-standingly actualizable, regardless of its environment, regardless of any further story of what it takes to enjoy such contents. And then materializing it while keeping that assumption in place. Putnam could certainly cite McDowell and say, see, McDowell agrees with me about this. But the problem is that this is all an explanation of what McDowell's doing in Mind and World. And there McDowell doesn't mean to be repeating those other thoughts of his. In fact, he means to be going to what he thinks is a much more fundamental issue. It's actually, I'm sorry I don't have my copy of Mind and World on me, but since you'll be reading it next time, a sentence you might look out for. We assigned lectures 1 and 2, didn't we? But you might, since you've gotten the book, you might want to read the sort of, here it matters that you have the 2nd edition, not the 1st edition. In the 2nd edition, he added a kind of introduction or précis to the beginning of the book. That's partly a response to certain misunderstandings. I think Putnam's one of the people he has in mind. And there's a sentence there where he talks about a certain kind of philosophical worry being an inchoate an inept expression of a more fundamental philosophical anxiety. I think that's pretty much a straight quote what I just said. A way of putting what he's saying there is that this kind of Cartesian issue, he thinks, is an inchoate and inept expression of something which later in the history of philosophy clarifies itself as a much more fundamental philosophical anxiety of the sort that he's taking himself to address in Mind and World. So he thinks there's a connection between these two things. But he would feel that Mind and World was completely being misunderstood if what it was doing was taking itself to just be reformulating the questions in Cartesian terms. That would be, by his lights, to be continuing to keep the issues in inchoate and an inept formulation of what the fundamental issue is. I was going to go through this quotation, but I'm running out of time. So let me just tell you what I would try to show you if we went through it slowly. Putnam wants the contemporary, does language hook onto the world issue that McDowell, sometimes him and other people have been worrying about, itself to simultaneously be addressed by his challenge of a Cartesian assumption in philosophy of perception. And I don't think that's going to work. I think if you look at people like McDowell himself, or Bob Brandon, or Michael Dummett, or lots of other people who are interested in this kind of question, they're not going to be worried by Putnam's challenge of the interface conception in Cartesian philosophy of language, philosophy of perception. Indeed, a number of them are going to say, well, yes, I think you're exactly right about that. But this is a different problem. They'll claim it's a completely different problem. They might not be right about that. But it's not going to have any force to say, here's the crucial mistake, the interface conception, understood in Cartesian terms. If they think they can agree with that, and that doesn't touch the problem they have in the philosophy of language, because the problem they're having in philosophy of language is not how do we sort our true claims from our false claims, given that there's this interface. But they think their question is, how can there so much as be a fact of the matter about it, to quote Kripke, whether we're adding or clouding. If they think that's their problem, you're not going to see the bearing of this. Now, Putnam takes these two things to be connected because he realizes there's a kind of phraseology that moves across the two cases. But the question is, why are we addressing the same problem? And clearly addressing the assumption on a Cartesian construal of the phraseology. Is that going to therefore immediately hit the people who are worried about this kind of issue in philosophy of language? I don't think they're going to feel moved. I think they're going to read the Dewey lectures and think, well, all very well, but this is old hat. Doesn't criticize me. And I think McDowell's going to think, no, this is a misunderstanding of what I'm doing. Thank you very much. But I do mean to be criticizing those people who are addressing this issue. And you're teaching them to read it this way is causing them to misunderstand the force of my book. Whether they agree with it or not, once they understand it, this is keeping them from even understanding what I'm trying to do in the book. So that's the setup, a class on Wednesday. It's one big prolegomena. I'm sorry if it seems like too big a warm-up for the final pitch, but it's a prolegomena for now turning to McDowell's Mind and World and trying to see how what he's doing in that book is related with respect to the issues that we've looked in the class.